Hello YouTube. As any Oblivion player knows, Cyrodiil is dotted with mysterious white ruins containing many dangers. These ruins are all that remain of the once mighty Ayleid Empire, an elven empire that before its fall spanned across all of Cyrodiil, parts of Hammerfell, parts of Blackmarsh and parts of Valenwood. It was one of Tamriel's very first political superpowers, and in this video we'll talk about its rise, its heyday and what eventually led to its fall. There won't be any spoilers for Oblivion Remastered in this video, by the way, at least not for any of the main stories, maybe only for some side quests and minor dialogue, so feel free to watch it during your playtime. So, the Ayleid Empire, a once massive empire in the heartland of Tamriel, stretching across Cyrodiil and some of its bordering provinces. The empire was founded by the Ayleid Elves, or the Wild Elves, a race of elves that by the time of Oblivion and Skyrim is long since extinct. You see, their empire's history mostly takes place during the so-called Merethic era, a time in Tamriel's history where time itself mostly wasn't recorded yet. For context, that's more than 3000 years before the events of Oblivion and Skyrim. And in order to understand how this once massive empire started, we need to go even further back in history, to around the middle of the Merethic era. It was around this time that the very earliest ancestor race to all elves on Tamriel, the so-called Aldmer, migrated to Tamriel from their ancient homeland of Aldmeris, a continent that's semi-mythical that may or may not have even existed, which was facing some danger or doom which forced the Aldmer that were living on it to leave it and to search for a new homeland. If you want that full explanation on that whole story, watch my video on Aldmeris, which is in the description of the video. But what you need to know for this video is that the Aldmer left Aldmeris in a large migration, sailing the seas looking for a new homeland. And eventually they found the Somerset Isles, the modern day homeland of the High Elves, their descendants. However, the High Elves, or the Aldmer with a T, are not the only descendants of the ancient Aldmer, so with a D. As not long after they settled themselves on the Somerset Isles, groups of Aldmer started migrating away from the Somerset Isles towards the larger continent of Tamriel, which they found to the northeast. These different groups of Aldmer settled in different parts of Tamriel, founding their own civilizations away from the original colonies, and over time they evolved into the different races of elf on Tamriel. Some Aldmer settled in modern-day Valenwood and evolved into the Wood Elves or the Bosmer. Others settled in modern-day Morrowind and became the golden-skinned Chimer, who were later cursed and then became the Dark Elves. There was also a group that traveled all the way to Skyrim, who became the pale-skinned Snow Elves, and a group that traveled to High Rock to become the Dereni Elves. And those who settled in the heartland of the continent, so modern-day Cyrodiil and some of the border regions, they became the Ayleids. Of all elvish civilizations founded in ancient Tamriel, the Ayleid civilization was by far the largest. It spanned across the largest area and it had the largest population. They built large magical cities, which had above ground and underground sections for people to live and work in. Now, as far as we know, this massive civilization did not have any central authority. Despite the fact that we call it the Ayleid Empire, there was no Ayleid Emperor. Rather, the empire consisted of several smaller kingdoms and city-states which spanned across the entire heartland, and who all seemed to have a loose alliance with one another, acting through cooperation, but all having their own independence to do whatever they wanted. Although there were times when the empire did have a figurehead or champion of sorts, a unifying figure for all the Ayleid peoples, but that individual then did not have any political power over the individual states and really acted as more of a figurehead. Now, during the first few centuries of the empire's existence, they also had a unified culture. In every Ayleid kingdom, one could find the same traditions and same religion. And the very center of their religion and culture, they built in the center of Lake Rumer, on what's now the Imperial Isle. They built a massive spire temple, a gigantic tower which became the center of their religion and culture, which they called the Temple of the Ancestors, now known as the White Gold Tower. It was a mystical temple with strange metaphysical powers, which held the most holy of the Ayleid artifacts, which were called the 10 Statues of the Ancestors. The empire of the Ayleids at this time was large and it was prosperous. However, at some point in the late Merethic era, things began to change. You see, just as the elves had migrated from Aldmeris in the south, the first humans began showing up on Tamriel around the same time as they migrated from their ancestral homeland of Atmora to the north. Now, early human history in the Elder Scrolls universe is a very complicated subject, but to oversimplify some history that I covered in detail before, most historical accounts have humanity starting on the continent of Atmora. From there had been countless small migrations to Tamriel. The rulers of Atmora often banished criminals to Tamriel, but noble second sons often went there as well with their followers to conquer new lands, as did human tribes looking for new lands. These small-scale migrations led to a small but prominent human population in the provinces of High Rock, Hammerfell, Cyrodiil and Skyrim. These human populations were often in the minority in their territories, as the elves by then had already been firmly established in their empires and kingdoms. This led to humans often becoming second-class citizens, or worse, in the already established elven societies. Now, within the Ayleid Empire, the humans seem to have been treated in a variety of ways. In some Ayleid kingdoms, humans seem to have become second-class citizens, being able to live in freedom, but having a lesser position within society to the Ayleid elves. While in some other kingdoms, humans got simply enslaved by the Ayleids. You see, Ayleid kingdoms had always had a quite extensive system of slavery, enslaving the early Khajiit, Argonians and the other beast races already living on Tamriel when they arrived, like the mystical now extinct Birdman of Cyrodiil for example. And as such, some kingdoms enslaved the humans as well when they arrived. However, it was around this time, when humans started populating the continent in larger groups, that a change started happening in the Ayleid Empire. You see, the Ayleids of the Empire originally had a religion based on ancestor worship, in which the Aedra, or the traditional divines like Mara and Auriel, played a large role. But it was around this time that their religion started to change. Many of the Ayleid kingdoms started to worship the Daedra and embraced the worship of Daedric princes like Hermaeus Mora, Molag Bal, Meridia, Mephala and Mehrunes Dagon as their primary religion. Previously obscure cults of the Daedra started to replace traditional religious organizations and infiltrate them, as Daedra worship brought the Ayleids great power, and that power allowed them to grow even more powerful and prosperous. The Ayleid kingdoms that embraced Daedra worship then summoned great armies of Daedra to fight for them and subjugate those whom they saw as lesser. And all of this came at a pretty bad price, as the Ayleid kingdoms of the Empire, where Daedra worship was encouraged and embraced, in those kingdoms the treatment of their slaves became progressively worse. In those kingdoms, summoned Daedra were used to herd and discipline the slaves, and slaves were killed for pleasure and for sport by the Ayleids, with pain and flesh sculpting of humans becoming an art form in their society. Pretty macabre. Now, the Ayleids of the Daedra worshipping kingdoms became more and more reliant on slave labor at this time, for everything from their farming to their building, and they treated their slaves worse and worse. Actually, it was so bad that they seemingly drove some of Cyrodiil's forgotten beast races extinct. Now, I've been continually emphasizing the Daedra worshipping kingdoms in this, as other kingdoms who refused to embrace the worship of the Daedra did not follow this trend. In fact, in the late Merethic era, the Aedra worshipping Ayleid kingdoms and the Daedra worshipping Ayleid kingdoms were locked in a painful and long civil war, which they called the Narvincel Schism, where the two cultures fought for dominance in the empire. However, in the civil war, it was just a matter of time until the Daedra worshipping kingdoms would win, as they used endless waves of summoned Daedric creatures in order to overwhelm the Aedra worshipping kingdoms. This civil war raged across the Ayleid Empire from the late Merethic era until the year 198 of the First Era, so quite a long time, and it ended with the Aedra worshippers in the end being subjugated, the humans and beast races living in those territories being enslaved, and several groups of Ayleids being forced to settle elsewhere as their way of life became officially banned in the Heartland. This civil war, however, did significant damage to the Ayleid Empire itself and weakened it significantly, and in order to rebuild, they started exploiting their slaves even more and treated them even worse. And then, in less than 50 years after the end of the civil war, the breaking point came. You see, something interesting had happened north of Cyrodiil in Skyrim, because by the end of the Merethic era, there were large waves of humans coming from Atmora to purposefully colonize Skyrim. And while the story of what happened is quite complex, an oversimplified version of events is basically the ancestors of the Nords came to settle in Skyrim. The Snow Elves, who had a civilization there, did nothing at first, but then they killed off an entire Nordic city. Then the ancient hero of the Nords, Ysgramor, went back to Atmora and said to the rulers there, "Hey, they killed us while we tried to colonize that continent. Let's kill them." So then he came back to Skyrim with an army, and then he and the subsequent Nordic rulers in the next few centuries started to go absolutely hardcore and drive out the snow elves to a point where a centuries-old civilization was just completely gone in the end, and the snow elves were driven to extinction, and the Nords then officially proclaimed a Nordic Empire in Skyrim and some of the border regions. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that covers about the essence. And you know, the stories of this happening spread across Tamriel, and the slaves of the Ayleid Empire at that point thought, if the Nords can band together and overthrow an ancient elvish civilization, why not us? So, barely 2 years after King Vrag of the Nords proclaimed the Nordic lands in Skyrim to be the Nordic Empire, the slaves of Cyrodiil started rebelling against their elven masters, under the leadership of a woman named Alessia, who was dubbed the Slave Queen, and with the power of the mythical heroes Pelennor Whitestrake and the demigod Morihos, the first Minotaur. They started a rebellion which spread across all of Cyrodiil, overthrowing the oppressive Ayleid kingdoms and freeing the slaves all across the Ayleid Empire. And within a year, the rebels had captured the ancient Temple of the Ancestors, the White Gold Tower, and the lost figurehead of the Ayleids, Umoril the Unfeathered, was defeated by the hero Pelennor Whitestrake. This event is considered to be the turning point of the rebellion, as the remains of the Ayleid Empire quickly started to disintegrate after the fall of the White Gold Tower and the defeat of their last leader. While at the same time, the first Cyrodiilic human empire was then proclaimed with Alessia as its first empress. Now, that does not mean that the Ayleid race ended there, not at all actually, as despite the fall of the empire, the Ayleids continued to be a presence in history for several more centuries, even if their numbers significantly dwindled. In fact, in the first few years of the first Cyrodiilic Empire, we saw relative harmony between the Ayleids, the humans and the beast races living within the empire. You see, during the rebellion, several Ayleid kingdoms, basically all the Ayleid kingdoms which had lost the civil war against Daedra worship and wanted to return to Aedra worship, joined the side of the humans in the civil war, and as such, many Ayleid kingdoms continued to exist in the new human-dominated empire. There were also some remnant groups of Daedra worshippers who continued to be a thorn in the empire side, and they would be instigators of several conflicts in the early years of the empire, but the empire eventually stamped them out. But there's no denying that the Alessian rebellion ended the lives of many Ayleids, and that, in combination with their own earlier civil war, led to an extremely dwindled population by the beginning of the First Era. This period we call the Late Ayleid period, and in it we can see some desperate attempts of a dying people to get back to their glory days. And to an extent this kinda worked, as some of the Ayleid kingdoms in the Empire actually flourished. However, a new enemy was already on the rise for them, because while the first Empress Alessia was actually quite tolerant towards the elves and sought unity, sometime after her death an extremist faction called the Alessian Order took power in the new Cyrodiilic Empire. They instigated many reforms in the empire, from cultural reforms to religious reforms, and one of the most impactful reforms that they instigated was the abolishment of the Ayleid kingdoms. They were no longer recognized by the empire, and basically this was a signal of get out of our land. Because the Alessian Order largely consisted of humans who never forgave the elves for their centuries of enslavement, so one of the first things that they did was abolishing the Ayleid kingdoms in the empire and making sure that the Ayleids left the empire's borders, with many of Cyrodiil's remaining Ayleids joining what remained of Ayleids outside of Cyrodiil, so on the border of Blackmarsh and Hammerfell and in Valenwood. And those who remained in Cyrodiil eventually were targeted by the Order in anti-Ayleid pogroms, where the Alessian armies decimated and destroyed the remaining Ayleid realms within the empire. By this point, the remaining Ayleids were scattered in different kingdoms and realms outside of Cyrodiil, which all faced problems of one sort or another, causing Ayleid population numbers to even further dwindle. And then they were gone. Well, not really gone, they just fizzled out. Some kingdoms fell to the pogroms of the Alessian Order, some faced other disasters, others fell apart by themselves, and the remaining Ayleids, they slowly diminished. Some mated with other races of elf and after a few generations essentially blended in with them. Others survived in very small colonies which eventually also fell apart. It was a really slow process. A very anticlimactic end to a once massive empire that spanned across Tamriel's heartland. They did not end with a bang, but they just fizzled out. Here and there, Ayleids from dwindling communities would appear in history, like in the very early Second Era, there were still some surviving Ayleids which historians could even interview, and around that time there were only a few semi-nomadic tribes of Ayleids left who roamed different parts of Tamriel. But by the middle of the Second Era, all of them were gone. Well, except for the last Ayleid, Laloriran Dainar, but his story I've told in another video, and he's actually a pretty special case as he was locked in Oblivion for a while. Check out the video description of this video for my video on him. Now, what to make of the Ayleid Empire? Well, I personally find it to be one of the most intriguing parts of Elder Scrolls lore. In fact, I find the so-called era of Elvish dominance, so the Meretic era, the era in which you had the Ayleid Empire in the Heartlands, the Snow Elf Kingdom in Skyrim, the Direni hegemony in High Rock, and the High Fidelity culture in Morrowind, one of the most fascinating periods of Tamriel's history, because it shows us a Tamriel which is radically different from the one that we know now. And that, in my opinion, is just really interesting. But that being said, that's about all that I can say about the Ayleid Empire for now, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video, and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls universe today. And if I did, why not give the video a like, as that's how the mighty YouTube algorithm decides what content is worthy and what content is not worthy. Anyway, all that's left for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Doji, Hunter Joe, KLegendM, King Chris 20, RB Dash, Volkior of Argonia, Devin Mattingly, Rakai and Sword of Bushido. These people, along with all the others on screen, keep my channel afloat, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will see you all in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, probably next week,